Everyone, and thanks so much for being here, and thanks for such a lovely introduction, Richard. I'm going to try and keep reasonably brief. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and what I hope to do with it, and then I'm going to read a little bit from the book. And then really why we're all here today is to have the discussion. So I'm really keen to get people's comments and thoughts in the chat and answer your questions. So a little bit about what I wanted to do with the book. Really, the first aim that I had was to try and give readers a real sense of what it means to be a family in the context of imprisonment. And I think for me, that meant starting with looking critically at what we mean by family and the concept of family itself. So I didn't go into the research with any sort of preconceived set of relationships that I wanted to research or look into. I wanted to give people the space to define family in any way that they wanted to. So I really wanted that to come across in the book, and some of the kind of ideas and tools that I found really useful for doing that has been the work of David Morgan and Janet Finch. And some of you will be familiar with that, but for those of you who aren't, really the idea is summed up in the phrase like family is what family does. So we are all sort of maintaining and building our family relationships through the everyday things that we do, whether it's having breakfast or celebrating Christmas or celebrating Diwali or Eid or sharing memories or telling stories or doing the school run. All of those things are the way that we all do family. And for families affected by imprisonment, it becomes much more difficult to do family, but families also had really diverse and creative ways that they tried to keep family going in this context. So families were keeping imaginary football leagues going. They were sending in as many home comforts as they absolutely possibly could into the prison for the person who was there. And they were using perfume and aftershave to kind of remind themselves of the person to create closeness and comfort. So all sorts of different strategies. But the second thing that I wanted to do with the book, as well as really show that all families affected by imprisonment, they're different and they're unique. There's also some really important commonalities amongst the families who participated in my project. So the project is a small scale qualitative project, so it won't reflect every family. But for the families who took part in this research, the person who is doing the bulk of the work in keeping this family going, they were virtually all women. And they were also virtually all women who were living with a greater or lesser extent of social marginality and poverty. And this made the job of keeping family going through imprisonment, it made it even harder. So that kind of takes me on to the third thing that I really wanted to do with the book. And that is to make the argument that imprisonment is not just difficult for families, it doesn't just create individual issues, it creates issues which are, or at least that I think should be, of really wider social concern. So the first argument I want to make is that imprisonment entrenches financial poverty amongst families who are already experiencing it. So to put that briefly, supporting someone in custody is really expensive. Like, it's really expensive. And it was money that these families just didn't have to spare in terms of traveling to prison, paying for phone calls, paying into PPC. This was all money that people just didn't have. And then alongside that, as well as taking a lot of time, supporting somebody in prison, it also uses a huge amount of money, time, and emotional labor. So it's not just entrenching the financial aspects of poverty, it entrenches the social aspects of social marginalization. Because for these women who are supporting a person in custody and keeping everything else going, it then limits the time that they have for themselves, for work, for volunteering, for education, for taking part in school life, community life. So it's entrenching both the sort of financial and the social aspects of poverty. So in the book, I argue that imprisonment is entrenching these gendered inequalities, but I also want to draw attention to that what imprisonment does is it brings families into really regular and frequent contact with the criminal justice system. And in the book, I think about this as an exercise of penal power. So, for example, the prison rules are dictating to families when they can visit, when they can phone home, what property they need to buy, what's going to be accepted. how they can spend their free time, how long they have to wait. So I see this really as an exercise of power over families, and then going beyond that, that families don't just receive this exercise of power passively, they also have their own views around whether this exercise of power is fair and just and reasonable and legitimate. And you perhaps see this most clearly when families are coming into kind of adversarial or difficult interactions with prison staff and criminal justice professionals. And very often, this is because prison rules are really complicated and these staff are doing a really difficult job and information is not clear and things are changing. But I argue that these everyday interactions, they're really, really important, even though they seem kind of little and everyday and unremarkable, because they give families messages about how valued they are as citizens. So in keeping with this kind of first aim of the book, of that I really wanted to give everybody a sense of what it means to be a family affected by imprisonment, I just want to tell you about some of my participants. So one of my participants, she's a young woman called Sophie. And when I first meet her, she's got a toddler and she's pregnant with her second baby and her partner's on remand. He eventually is sentenced and she has the second baby while he's in custody. And she just finds the whole experience really difficult. You know, she often says, you know, I'm struggling financially. She incidentally lost her job when she was pregnant with her first child because they sacked her. And when I said to her, you know, you do know that's illegal, she was like, well, what am I going to do about that? So she pays £20 a week into his prisoner personal cash, and that pays for phone calls. It helps them keep in touch. But she says, you know, I'm lucky if I have 50p left at the end of the week. And that money that I give to him, we're not paying down our debts now, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and that worries me. You know, emotionally, she says she's struggling. She talks about being at home with these two kids. She's in a flat that she didn't choose. She doesn't feel safe in the area without her partner. She has no time without the kids. She's not got a lot of family support. She talks about, you know, there's nothing in my community for me to do with them. There's a park across the road, but it's covered in broken glass. It's covered in syringes. I'm not going to take them there. So Sophie spends a lot of time at the prison. When her partner is on remand, she can visit 5 days a week, and she does. And then when he's sentenced, she visits once or twice a week and brings the children to family visits. And of all the people I'm going to talk about today, she probably has the worst relationship with the prison staff, but it's not the worst one of everyone in the study. And she really struggles with, she feels like she's there all the time, but they don't want to get to know her, and they don't want to get to know her kids, and nobody's helping her. And she talks about going into the visit room. There's this big turnstile you have to get through, and she's holding the new baby and she's trying to push her toddler through, but her daughter's scared of it and she's bumping her head, and she's just like, nobody wants to help me. And the same, she gives another story about, I came up in the pouring rain when I was pregnant, heavily pregnant. It took me like 2 buses, came up to hand in trousers for him, but they won't take them because they've got strings in the waist. And that's not acceptable. So I've spent all this time shopping for them and they won't take them, and I'm here in the pouring rain. And she just found that incredibly, incredibly difficult. And I'm sure that a lot of people could understand why. Somebody else I want to talk about is a participant called Joanne, and she's also caring for a new baby. But this baby's her granddaughter, because her daughter and her partner were sentenced at the same time for the same offences when the baby was very, very small. So Joanne gives up her job to stop the baby being taken into care. And this was something that she found very personally difficult because, one, she says, you know, I find being on benefits for the first time, I find that really embarrassing, but also practically, at the time I was doing the research, everything's moving to digital by default. She was like, I don't really have access to the internet. I'm not very good on computers. I've had weeks and weeks and weeks where I didn't have any money. But at the same time, like, her costs are going up and up and up because her daughter's doing a short sentence and Joanne wants to keep her tenancy going for her. So she's paying for rent, she's paying for bills, and she's doing all these things so that her daughter can have her life back. When she gets out, she'll have somewhere to live, she can have her daughter back. And Joanne has quite positive relationships with the visitor centre in particular, but she feels like the criminal justice system is just not taking account of her needs. So she claims for some of the costs that she incurs through the assisted visit scheme, but she's like, that covers a quarter of what I pay to come and visit my daughter and make sure that she has a relationship with her child. And you have to claim that afterwards, and so you're paying all the money up front, and she just finds that incredibly difficult. And she's another one who doesn't have a huge amount of family support because the whole thing's been so difficult that her parents are currently not really speaking to her. And the last person I want to talk about is Alicia. She's a mother of a grown-up adult son, and he's serving a long-term sentence. And she is quite, she tells me like, oh, I've visited every prison in Scotland. She's quite knowledgeable of the prison rules. And she's really interesting because she's struggling financially. Her son, like his income paid into the household income, and now he's in prison. They've lost that. Her daughter, who's also a young adult, she pays into her brother's PPC. So at a time where she should be sort of developing her own life and like having money for her, it's going into the prison. Alicia has really big struggles with her mental health. She does her shopping at night so that she doesn't have to see anyone. She just takes prescription drugs to manage her mental health. And while she struggles with all that, she has very, very good relationships with the prison staff, which is interesting because she feels like her concerns about her son's mental health are taken seriously. So these are three just little extracts from the lives of my participants. And I want you to kind of keep that context of managing all these difficulties that they have while I'm doing this little bit of reading from the book about some of the bigger arguments. So, as noted in chapter 1, a particularly useful tool for exploring the wider implications of these seemingly everyday interactions is the concept of legitimacy. And this is, legitimacy highlights not only are power relationships an inherent part of prison life, but they're also extremely challenging to get right. And this nuanced view of the potential effects of a careless or unreflective use of penal power assists us in understanding the pain and frustration experienced by families when, for example, they invest considerable time, money, and effort to come to the prison or to hand in property, but are unable to do so due to the decisions taken by officers in the context of a myriad of opaque prison rules. Theories of legitimacy also help us to see that not only does the prison exercise considerable power over families, but families are not passive audiences to this power. Rather, they can and do draw their own conclusions about how fair, just, and legitimate they perceive the prison to be. Indeed, given the multiple negative effects of imprisonment discussed in the previous chapter, it's perhaps unsurprising that families who experience difficult interactions with the criminal justice professionals could feel considerable anger and hostility both to individual officers and to the wider criminal justice system. This was clearly articulated by members of the Visitor Centres team, who felt that such unfavourable or oppositional views were widespread amongst the families and children who used the centre. As discussed in chapter 1, theories of legitimacy would foretell that where subordinate parties feel the power exercised over them is unfair, they are less likely to comply with the rules power holders seek to enforce. And indeed, there's a large volume of empirical evidence that demonstrates that when individuals are more likely to accept decisions that they feel have been reached fairly, whether or not they are favourable. And this was evident in the accounts of families, as those with poor relationships with prison officers also challenged their authority. So Brooke says, a screw turned round to me and says, didn't he tell me how to do my fucking job? And I ask her, does that make you not care about the rules and wanting to listen to them? Darcy, nah, because they didn't care about the rules, they didn't follow them. Brooke, they didn't treat us with respect. Darcy, they have a set of rules that they are meant to treat us and the prisoner with respect no matter what they have done. But they didn't, so why should we care? We go in with an attitude because they have one. Brooke and Darcy's questioning of why they should adhere to the demands of officers when they themselves do not follow the rules reveals the potentially contradictory effects of a rigid application of penal power over families. While officers may feel they are prioritising institutional security and order by leaving little room to engage flexibly with families, they risk undermining penal legitimacy and subsequently also normative motivations for compliance. Yet this fostering of feelings of mistrust or animosity towards the criminal justice system has implications beyond eroding pro-social dispositions and the willingness of children and families to seek help from state institutions. A failure to achieve legitimate power relations can have damaging consequences in terms of how subordinate parties feel they are perceived in terms of worth and status by those in power. And the communicative function of such interactions are heightened further when the person in question belongs to an already marginalised group. Thus, careless treatment at the hands of state agencies, such as the police or the prison, can communicate that the individual lacks full citizenship, in turn undermining civic and political participation. That the prison does not therefore only exacerbate social marginality experienced by families by draining their already scarce resources. The cumulative effect of repeated and potentially negative interactions with the justice system also has the power to erode feelings of citizenship and belonging and how they are valued by the state. So I'm going to stop reading from the book there, but just to finish, I want to be really clear about what I'm not saying. So I'm trying to make the argument that imprisonment is damaging on a societal level in terms that it entrenches poverty and marginalisation and also feelings of citizenship, and that the justice system is on the side of these families. I'm not saying that this happens because criminal justice professionals do not do a really good job, or they're not really keen to welcome and support families, because I also interviewed officers who really were keen to do that. What I'm saying is that this is an incredibly difficult job, and it's very hard to balance competing factors. And when that doesn't happen well, these everyday interactions become incredibly important. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to hand over, I think, to Rachel.
Great, thank you, Cara. Thank you, Rachel. Over to you.
Thank you, and thanks, Cara. That was great, and really, I'm really pleased that you talked about some of the participants in some detail, because I'm going to look a little bit more at some of the bigger themes in your work. But first of all, a really big thank you for inviting me to speak. It's a real pleasure to be here. I do wish it was in person, and like everyone, I'm missing that personal interaction. But on the other hand, isn't it amazing that we can have an audience like this from, you know, all over, all sorts of different places. It's really good to be able to do that. So I've followed Cara's work for a long time. I came across her work when she was a doctoral student and was really very impressed from then. And I was lucky enough to be her external examiner for her PhD thesis at the University of Edinburgh, along with Richard Sparks. And she's also part of a group of prisoners' families network that I organise, of researchers, and most importantly, though, for our purposes today, this book, Families, Imprisonment and Legitimacy, The Cost of Custodial Penalties, is published in the book series that I edit, Routledge Studies on Crime, Justice and the Family. And I'm really delighted about that. And also that this was the first book to be published in what's really a very new series. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But going back to Cara's thesis that this book was based upon, her thesis was just really excellent and unusually was awarded in full without corrections. And Richard Sparks and myself really encouraged Cara to explore the possibility of publishing her work as a book. And this was for a number of reasons. She writes beautifully, she shows a real connection with, and I think a really respectful understanding of the people whose lives she explores, and she produces work that's both theoretically sophisticated and empirically rigorous. And I think she has a quality in her writing that you don't always see in doctoral theses. She's a good storyteller, and the different components of her work really hang together well and unfold in a way that's more than the sum of each part. So I'm really delighted that Cara's book is published in my book series, because I think it really represents, and I think fully realises, what I had in mind when I put that book series together. So the series developed from an interest that I had over the years in the ways that crime and family intersect. So really thinking about how the family is one of the most important institutions in society, and yet within criminology, it's fairly novel to think about the ways that it intersects with crime and justice in the round, rather than dividing this into a number of standalone substantive areas, for example, family violence or prisoners' families and so on. And I wanted in the series to really include cutting edge work that was asking new questions, focusing on new topics, that was innovative, pushing debates. And I think Cara's work is all of these. And really there were some kind of key principles which I think Cara's work, as I say, really kind of fully realises. The first is really wanting to get away from overly simplistic criminological conceptions of failing families causing crime, which are such kind of common themes in much criminological dialogue. Wanting to build upon, in the series, some newer work coming through in recent years that has really increased the intellectual rigour and the deep engagement of the prisoners' families field. And in a sense, this is something I think to do with the kind of maturation of that field, that in its early days, it was very much identifying that prisoners' families suffered, but it wasn't really asking the kind of much bigger questions about why this mattered, or hooking some of those findings into some of the kind of bigger, deeper questions about, for example, the sociology of punishment, about human rights, about social justice and civic identity and so on. And then I think also thinking about kind of interdisciplinary and cross-cutting themes, that the relationship between the family and the state, and the way in which the state intervenes in life, really in family life, takes particular shape around the problem of crime, that the family is constructed in various ways in formal policy responses to crime and informal responses such as stigmatization and shaming, the wide-reaching impact of crime and its consequences, how that impact travels through kin ties. The family is both a site of support and a site of conflict. The construction of kin relationships and the ways that we understand what it means to be, for example, a mother or a son, and the ties that bind family members together, and the ways in which responsibility for kin manifests morally, ethically, and in some cases legally, and the problem family as a site of politics or social reform. And I think that Cara's work really epitomises and exemplifies many of those aims in the series. And in particular, her book makes several really important contributions to the field. It's a really strong account, I think, of the reach of the penal system into the lives of families in Scotland, what it means to be a family in the context of imprisonment, and how family members construct and maintain relationships, as Cara's been explaining. It really gives us an account of this extension of punishment through kin ties. And there's been quite a number of kind of debates and discussions about how best to conceptualize this recently. Should we think of it as secondary punishment or collateral punishment? I've written recently with Shona Minson about how this is better characterized as symbiotic harms, but Cara shows really in quite fine detail how the punishment of imprisonment reaches into every aspect of legally innocent family members' lives. And as Cara's spoken about legitimacy and how the distressing effects of imprisonment on families really undermine their sense of legitimacy, and this huge impact this has on civic identities. So this disinterested or disparaging treatment at the hands of criminal justice professions, and the kind of undergoing surveillance and regulation in prison visiting, creates quite long-term and damaging consequences. And these processes of interaction convey to families their status and their value and worth, and really kind of damage their sense of civic identity. And Cara also critiques simplistic instrumental notions of families as an aid to desistance. Although families can be really important to reintegration and desistance, it's important that we don't just see them as an immediate source of support. Really, the injustice she shows of laying expectations about this at the feet of family members without considering how they themselves might need support. And importantly, the gendered ethics of caring here, and that it's often the women, the wives and the mothers that are doing this work. And I think this sociological emphasis on her work on family practices, and she flags for us here, which I think is really important in the field, the importance of diverse kin relationships. This often makes me think of what the author Armstead Maupin calls our logical family instead of our biological family. And it's really important to see that in this field, because there is a gap in understanding about who the significant people are in the lives of prisoners. beyond studies which are often about heterosexual partners or children. And Cara describes doing family and what this means, the everyday practices through which people construct their family lives. And the sociological richness she provides here really stayed with me long after reading her work and left me thinking about how people do this and how we all do this and what that can really add to our understanding when we're looking at people's lived experience and real lives. And as Cara's just mentioned, the importance of poverty and social marginalisation and its high levels in families of prisoners, and the kinds of questions this leads us to ask about social justice in a democratic society. Families of prisoners are more widely subject to other forms of administrative social exclusion and often overlooked and ignored by official agencies, as Cara shows so well. So the key point in her work, I think, is that imprisonment harms individual families, but it has wider social costs for civic and social inclusion, and these wider consequences should really matter to anyone who has a concern about social justice or about the place of citizens in a democratic society. So congratulations, Cara. This really is an excellent book, and I think it should be read by anyone with an interest in the reach of criminal justice, prison and punishment, what they really do, and who is actually brought into that reach. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to your future work and for seeing the directions that you take this in.
Brilliant, thank you, Rachel. Okay, without further ado, Laura.
Hi there. I'm just conscious of the time, so I'll try and limit my comments to as short as I can, but thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this event. I've known Cara for a few years now, and I remember fondly her sitting in one of our glass goldfish bowls trying to furiously finish her book, exhausted and tired as colleagues dropped her bits of chocolate to keep her going. And I'm just so happy that she's reached this milestone of publishing her PhD, which is never easy. You often think, I'll just turn my PhD into a book, and you realise that you actually have to often rewrite the whole thing. So it is a very, very difficult undertaking, and in a subject that still surprises me how under-researched it is. So congratulations, Cara. And I also, like Rachel, I'm really looking forward to seeing how you take this forward into new and diverse and dynamic research areas. So I've actually read the book a couple of times now, and which is not common for me these days, but I learned so much from this book. I learned a lot about the diversity of family forms, but also how the family becomes a risk to be managed, corrected and kind of reborn in a carceral space. So whilst her book is certainly a call for improvements to access and support for families during and outside of incarceration, and I think, as echoing Rachel, it really is a call for a kind of social justice approach to looking at incarceration broadly defined. And I'm also really excited about what comes next from Cara's work. So I'm going to confine my comments to three key areas that jumped off the page for me when I read this book. And in the first area that I would like to give some consideration to are what I call the tropes and the traps facing families affected by imprisonment. Cara's book not only illuminates the kind of dire effects of incarceration when maintaining good relationships and understanding and locating how to manage poor relationships as well within a kind of impacting carceral environment. She uses the phrase in her book, collateral damage that penal power produces on familial imprisonment. So the work really extends so much good critical criminological scholarship that locates the prison as a problematic space within the context of the family and vice versa. So what struck me as interesting when I think about the tropes and the traps is that not only do you see the family as in need, but you see the family is framed differently. So you see the prison perpetuating a discourse of fix the person, but also what came out of the book for me is fix the family. And that's quite problematic in a penal context. So Cara's work shows for me that a penal policy that's looking at familial imprisonment is not the same as a policy that focuses truly and genuinely on the well-being of people who are harmed by incarceration or who are caught up in justice institutions. Because clearly the simple matter is that across Scotland and across the UK and the world, penal expansion has also coincided with welfare contraction, and familial imprisonment, as evidenced in her book, kind of mirrors this. So what's interesting about the book for me as well, related to this, is the Scottish context. So unlike England and Wales, we are now at a point in Scotland where, to me, who doesn't actually do a lot of research in Scotland, but from what I understand from the good scholarship out there, is that welfare aims, ideals, and institutions are increasingly becoming the key variables in criminal justice policy and practice. So the prison system in Scotland aims to deliver welfare, so much so that the pendulum has swung, as Cara shows, toward a view that welfare can, and welfare for families can, and indeed should, have real purchase in the character of punishment. Now, as Cara's work beautifully and bleakly shows, that the economic, political, and social hardship that exists in society creates the inequalities that can and often lead to, and do often lead to, an experience of incarceration. But if when we insert the family into that context, we can think of familial imprisonment as mirroring and enmeshing the tropes and traps of inequality. And I've been thinking about this since Ruben Miller's paper yesterday as well. I've been thinking about Bruce Western's work, and I'm quoting here, where Beckett and Western argue that the more exclusionary approaches to social marginality are especially likely, they say, to be adopted by states which house more of those defined in contemporary political discourse as so-called troublemakers. And Cara's extracts, I think, indicate that as well. So I'm going to read a little bit of Cara's book, if that's okay. If I've got this right, Cara, and I won't be much longer. Cara says Scotland has struggled with long-standing difficulties with imprisonment. She says it also faces considerable families affected by imprisonment face the five challenges in poverty and inequality. And then she goes on to say, it is clear that austerity has had a damaging consequence for social life in poor Scottish communities, limiting the resources and social capital available to the people who live in them. And she's paraphrasing David McKendrick from Glasgow Caledonian here. The second point I want to make about what came out for me in Cara's book is what I would call the visible mobilisation of welfare bureaucracies, leading to what Sharon Wright at Glasgow University has called, I think it's Sharon, welfare conditionality. Families get caught up in this and become deeply enmeshed in its nets. So is the case, and I think punishment society scholars are kind of universally agreed on this, that the welfare state has been subject to state criminalisation processes through sanctions, censure and punishment of so-called welfare violations. Then the penal system will not be at odds with state strategies, but it will be at odds with conflicting narratives for families, particularly around human rights and rights broadly defined. So generally, with these kinds of sanctions and support for families outside, governments aim, I think, from what I've read and from reading Cara's work, aim to kind of almost change and alter the tone and contours of what is a family and the behaviour of families. So we see these tensions, as we often see in prison sociology, active support and a social control custodial space, penal power versus rights, penal power versus social justice, and penal power versus risk, which is my third point, my concluding point about Cara's great book, is that one of the things I think that came out for me is this idea of problematizing familial imprisonment as risk. And this goes to Cara's point about legitimacy. Now, the kind of nature of the relationship between the two, and that is familial imprisonment and risk, it needs kind of further elucidation, I think, and further research. And Cara's begin doing that, and others who work in this area also. And we know that this is subtle, nuanced, rather than simple and direct. And another thing I wanted to say about this in relation to Cara's book is the really creative and innovative and relational way in which she connects to the people she's talking to, and the methods that she employs are really great. So going back to, as I conclude, a point that Cara made at the beginning, which is also really important and strikes me as resonant, is when you say, Cara, family is what family does. Well, so is prison. Prison is what prison does. And my question to you, Cara, is how effective is this trope of conditionality of the family in changing the behaviour of the incarcerated and or their families, and whether it should? And second, are there particular circumstances in which the use of a conditionality trope or idea to condition families to live better lives, is it ever justifiable in this complicated, highly contingent site of conflict? So for me, in the end, my takeaway message from this book wasn't solely on how to better improve family-friendly policies and strategies in prison, but that, again, it's another timely reminder, this book, that the importance of an inclusive welfare state to kind of liberal social democracies remains as vital as ever. And that is really under threat here from the pressures to offload not only the responses and needs of families, but the cost of welfare provision onto individuals themselves, and in Scotland, crucially, offloading that onto the voluntary sector. So I think Cara's work reminds us, because we need to keep being reminded of this and keep banging on about it, that there's a substantial welfare state is increasingly the principle and the main protection against the kind of threats to family and the kind of sites of prison as an abusive state, potentially, penal power, but also to reinforce the need to look at the family as a cultural phenomenon within a prison context. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Laura. So Cara, did you want to respond to any of the things that Laura has asked or Rachel has also said before we move on to other people's input?
I'll respond to that last point that Laura made just really briefly, and then we can put it out to the wider audience. But I think that is there's been huge progress in terms of recognising families affected by imprisonment, both in research and both in policy. And that's really, really positive. But I think Laura's comments speak to a real danger with this of a lot of this effort is focused on either promoting desistance or like fixing families. And none of the families that I spoke to, they didn't want to be fixed, right? Their problems weren't that they had bad attitudes or weren't good parents or didn't love their children, because they all did. They needed more money, right? They didn't need interventions that were focused on them. They needed interventions that like paid their bills and put community centres in their communities and met their sort of basic needs, gave us routes into education. You know, Sophie, who I spoke about, who lost her job when she was pregnant, she was like, I'd really love to go to college, but how can I ever do that when childcare costs more than I could ever earn? You know, and she did work in childcare. She's like, why would I put my own children in childcare and then not take home what it costs to do that? So yeah, there's a real danger in that the increased focus on family focus on the sort of like, what can we do to fix people so they're better citizens, rather than saying, how can we like meet people's rights as citizens? And I think that's a much more important, a much more useful framing and a more productive way to go forward.